Hello, fellow travelers. Welcome once again to the Unbroken Ground. This is episode 47. Thank you for joining me. If this is somewhere around your first time, or if you've been here for all 46 other episodes, including all of the bonus things we did and have done over the past couple of months, year. It's almost been a year. Then either way, glad you're here. My name is Paul, and I will be your guide on this journey of a podcast. So it's quite fun. I have the final. These are 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52 would be a year of podcasts. So I actually know what the final episodes are going to be. And I can tell you them. So this one is actually going to be about silence. The next week we're going to talk about darkness. And then we're going to do 4 Advent podcasts. So if you've ever been part of the Advent tradition, it was something that my church did growing up, but never really kind of understood it. And so, yeah, it'll be something that I'll be talking about, the 4 different weeks of Advent. I'm pretty excited about that. But this one, as I said, is going to be about silence, and I want to address a few things about silence and, go from there. So if you have any questions, always you can follow along on our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Unbroken Ground. You can also find us in Threads and also on Instagram at The Unbroken Ground. And, so if you have questions or suggestions, those are the places you could connect with me there. We also have email at theunbrokenground@gmail.com. So, let's jump in on silence. So as we think about the start of the holidays, we're here with looking at December, just a couple of weeks away. We're looking at the Advent season started. I wanted to kind of think through some big themes that are not necessarily addressed in the Advent, but I think have a very impactful, or at least for me, have a very interesting, impactful thing to look into. And the first one is the big theme of silence. And so haven't unpacked everything. I spent some time on Saturday just writing about it. Might put that into a blog later. I don't know. I was just doing some free writing and just kind of writing down some thoughts about it. So that might show up on the Patheos blog. But if either way, it is going to be what we talk about today. And one of the things that I want to bring to attention is that if you read through things like the book of Psalms, if you read through that, which are the example prayers and the example praise songs or worship songs of the people of God prior to Jesus being on the earth, and then Jesus used them as well, there are actually passages that point to a person's life when they are distant or are going through a period of not hearing from God. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more, but just for example, Psalm 22, which is a famous psalm because that is the psalm that Jesus quotes on the cross. Just before he says it's finished, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is Psalm 22, verse 1. And again, these are the prayers of God's people. Like God directed these prayers to be put in the Bible so that future generations, so that current generations, the people who were current when they were written and sung and when they were talked about and way back in ancient days, and now even up to us, would have this record. And I think it's an important one. So this is what Psalm 22, we'll do verses 1 through, let's just do the first 5. It says this: my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. And this is what I think. I mean, for there, that if we just stopped it, that's verse 2, into verse 2. That is a very raw and real thing to say to God. God, you have forsaken me. And yes, there is I guess, a picture that's being painted to a future use of that when Jesus comes along and says that. But there's also just it's a descriptive time in a follower's life. And this is not the only psalm that has this kind of language in it. So it's not like it's like, oh, well, that's not going to be very often, or that's not ever going to happen, because it's barely in the Psalms. If you read through the Psalms, there are very much these honest prayers. A lot of times it's, God, you've forsaken me. God, why have you allowed these bad things to happen to me? God, why are the righteous suffering and the unrighteous, why are they prospering? Those are all the things in there. So verse 1 and 2 is a very honest, gut-wrenching cry to say, God, I have cried out day and night, and yet you don't answer. I cry out by night, and yet I find no rest. So keep that in mind. File that away. We'll come back to that. This is where it continues on, and this is a very common theme in prayers and songs that you find in the Book of Psalms here. So it says this in verse 3. It says, Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you, our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. And so that's through 5. I think that's a good place to kind of stop and just kind of take our stock of what we're doing here, what we're talking about, because I think it suits the theme well. And the theme of this, I think, is that there is going to be a point in a mature Christian's life when that you will experience a time where it seems like God has gone silent. There's going to be a time when God allows your emotions and your brain and everything that to believe that you have been abandoned. And it's part of this walk and what it means to follow God, because it's at that point that we really begin to form an idea of what it is or why it is that we follow Jesus. Because when you only always have an easy time of it, your roots are not very deep. And it's in the time of hardship and even the time of silence that your roots begin to grow. That you have to figure out what it means to trust in God. And one of the tools that God uses to bring out trust from us as humans is silence. I think back to one of the podcasts I've done where Jesus was talking about prayer, and it's such an interesting way to describe, because Jesus, again, he uses this idea. He says, if you are visited by someone late at night and you don't have food for that visitor, you'll go over to your neighbor and you'll knock on the door and ask, and the neighbor will say, "Oh, well, I'm in bed. The kids are in bed. Don't bother me." And yet the neighbor will get you some bread, not because they are wanting to be neighborly and to serve you, but because you annoyed them, because you were persistent. And I think that there is a sense for a deeper walk with Jesus that means that you have to go beyond a base level that where you say, "Oh, I pray for it and I get my prayers answered. God is my Jehovah Jireh. He's my provider. He's my healer. Every time I pray and ask for it, He does it." And there's a level of connection and relationship that becomes that gets developed when that doesn't happen. When the answer is silence. And we struggle with silence. I thought about just seeing how long I could just start this podcast in between the introduction and actually talking about it, just like leaving silence, and how many of you would wait like a minute, would think, "Oh, did something go wrong?" I mean, silence unnerves us, and a lot of us try to avoid it. If you're in a car ride, then you have a podcast going, which if you listen to my podcast, that's okay. I mean, I appreciate it. But yeah, I may just fill the role of noise. I create noise for you so that you don't have to sit in silence. Because you're uncomfortable with that. Or you put music on, or you will, when you're at home and nobody else is home, you'll turn on the TV, not because you necessarily want to watch the show. You may not even be paying attention to it, but the background noise is enough to drown out the silence that kind of unsettles us. And I think that part of that is that silence makes us think about the brokenness first of our relationships. One of the classic husband and wife arguments and battles is give them the silent treatment. That a wife would ignore or not talk to her husband to show her disapproval or anger. And I think the question that then comes to our mind, because we're human and because we don't actually know how to relate to God other than the human ways that we relate to God, and we try to actually fit God into a very human style box, that I think that the question sometimes we have is God giving me the silent treatment? Is God angry with me, and so He won't talk? He won't interact. He won't hear my prayers. He has, as Psalm 22 says, He has forsaken me. And it may fully feel like that. Even Mother Teresa, who is a saint, I think. I can't remember if she got accepted in a sainthood or not. There's a lot of crazy things surrounding that have to happen. But I'm not going to knock it because it's not my cup of tea style. But I'm not saying that they're not following Jesus. And I'm not saying that whatever they say happened or didn't happen. But even Mother Teresa, who was such a sacrificial person, she went to go live amongst the most unlovable people, talked about the dark night of the soul. This idea that at some point you lose connection with God, and you begin to wonder if God will ever speak again. And for the people of God, in between the Old Testament, the last prophet, and the New Testament, the coming of Jesus, John the Baptist, it's generally accepted that there was about 400 years of silence where God did not speak. There was no scripture created or written down during that time, and generations, like whole generations, went by having heard about who God was, but never hearing from God. They went whole generations hearing about what their ancestors would say. God is this. He is faithful. He never abandoned. He's the one who fights our battles. To hearing about that, to living a reality where they have never had that opportunity to hear God's voice, to hear God, to see God doing something in the midst of their country, in the midst of their lives, in the midst of their family. So 400 years, that is longer than the United States has even been around. So, I mean, just imagine how many generations that have lived in the United States since it became a country, and then realize that about twice, well, not quite twice that, but close to twice that generation lived in this period of silence and anticipation. They knew that God had promised that there would be a Messiah. And so they waited and they watched, and yet they had to get on with living life, because by all intents and purposes and all of that, he just didn't show up. And you can't, I mean, how long can you wait? How long can you just wait around? And so the people of God kind of moved on and did what they normally do, which is go through the cycles of sin and repentance. And there were even some false prophets, false new messiahs who started rebellions out in the wilderness and died and got or were killed by the Romans. And so that was the kind of scene that we think of, or at least that's the setup for the arrival of Jesus. Is 400 years of God being silent. 400 years. Years of silence. God at work, but God not out in the opening working. God not blatantly being out. Instead, moving in the background amongst people, creating, preparing, making ready the way, so that one day we would have what we celebrate Christmas for, which is the birth of Jesus. But there were lives, generations of lives, who got married, had babies. Those babies grew up, got married, had babies. I mean, it was a very, very long time. And the people of God held on to this hope. But one of the things I think, again, to bring back to kind of the first idea here, is that silence is a representation of the brokenness that we have in our hearts and in our relationships. When Adam and Eve sinned, the first thing that they did was hid. The first thing that they did was hid from God. Adam and Eve sinned, and then they hid from God. And so that God had to seek them out. He had to call out to them. God had this normal activity of walking through the garden, and he did not need to call out to find where Adam and Eve were. And yet here, the brokenness enters in, and so there's no longer this relationship. The relationship is broken, and God has to call out, and Adam has to answer for his sin. And then, because of that sin, Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. No more daily walks with God. No more nightly strolls, evening strolls before and as the stars come out. Instead, they got kicked out. They experienced the brokenness of their relationship with God. And it hasn't super changed. Because when we decide to do things on our own, a lot of times God is silent. When we decide to do things that are against God's will, a lot of times God will allow us to do that. Because in order to have free love, in order to be able to freely express love for God, and have faith in God, which are two things that God truly values, in order for that to happen, there has to be the freedom to reject God, to hate God. And because we have that freedom, then there is the very real possibility that there is a brokenness that happens in our relationships and our communications with God. And so because of that, we experience silence. But as I talked about last week, the cool thing or the wonderful thing about God is that when we repent and we start heading back towards God, then he runs and picks us up. But there's another type of silence. It's not a silence born of sin, but it's a silence born of growth. There's a silence that's like God wants to grow you, and so he's going to make you work to connect with him. When we first start out on the walk, we talk to youth, and we talk to people that first start into their follow Jesus. They're like, oh, Jesus is so easy. He's always there for you. But in the back of their heads, we have to be thinking, or at least I do, of like, yeah, but it can be hard too. And I think that's why God and Jesus are so concerned about the community that you live in. Because when God goes silent for us, we need that reminder that he's not silent for everybody. We need that reminder, although he was for 400 years. He was silent. He didn't do a lot of the things that he'd been doing. And so we need that community reminder that even if I can't see what he's doing, I know that he's at work. And then even on top of that, we can see what he's doing in other people's lives. And there's this test of faithfulness, because God doesn't call us to be successful. He doesn't call us to be like kingdom builders in the sense of like we're the ones that are making the building happen. Instead, he calls us to be faithful workers. And God is the one who will raise up the building, raise up the people, raise up the leaders, or he won't. Your job is just to serve faithfully. And if you do that, then you grow in maturity, because when you serve faithfully, you learn what it means to truly follow God. But silence is so hard, because we a lot of times we need to try and interpret it. We need to try to understand it. We need to try to name it. We need to try to come up with the 5 steps to get rid of it. We need to have an exorcism of our sin. We need to fight against. But all of those things can contribute to it, to God being silent. But I think an important thing to remember is that sometimes God is silent to see what we will do, to see how we'll react, to see what we will say, what we will think, and what we will do. What will we tell other people? And so silence is often a tool that God uses to strengthen us spiritually. But we don't like silence. Silence is so hard for us, because silence allows us to start to really do some soul searching, and to let in all of the things that we've tried to keep out, that we didn't want to think about, that we didn't want to focus on. Silence is one of those things that allows the doors to open in our brains to think about those things. Silence is also hard because it means it represents the loss of a loved one, a friend. We'll never hear that voice, that brain, that person making the same comment, making the same mistake. We'll never hear that again. We'll never hear our grandparents, or maybe it's an uncle, maybe it's an aunt, maybe it's just a family friend who was so present as we think about these holiday gatherings, who was so present and now is gone. And so we struggle because silence is also just a part of grief. It's a part of loss. It's a part of the fact that even though God is with us till the end of the ages, as Jesus says, he'll never leave us nor forsake us, there are times that we just feel so alone. And we feel like David in Psalm 22, where we say, God, I cry out to you day after day, moment after moment, minute after minute. God, I am crying out to you, and you are not hearing my call. You're not responding. You're on the throne, God, but the bad guys are winning. If we put it that way. The unrighteous are prospering and the righteous are poor. God, how can this be when your word says that that's not what's supposed to happen? And so there becomes a real choice for us, a real choice to learn how to be faithful and content in both the good times where it's easy. Oh, it's so easy. You're on top of the world. You think you've got it all figured out. Nothing's throwing you for a loop. You know, health is fine. It's so easy. And then everything crashes down. And what do? How do you keep faith? How do you keep hope? How, in the midst of the silence, when everything around you is falling apart, how do you still believe? There's a question that always hangs over our heads, I think. When we're thinking about this idea of silence and questions that Jesus asked and those type of things, there's a question that hangs over our heads. And I think the question is, how do you know that you can trust God? How do you know you can trust God? How do you know, even if God was silent for 400 years, that he has a good plan, that he's a good father, that he is on the move, and he's about to do something that the world's never seen before? Yet how would you know? And I think that I think that is one of the hardest ideas for us to cope with. Because we really like the good God stories where it's like, oh, I had this need and God met me. Oh, I had this cancer and God, we went back and they did an x-ray and it was gone. But and I think I know I did a Pathos blog about this, but I think there's just a resistance in me that builds up for whatever reason. And one of the songs of this year that I've listened to that I really love is called "Kind" by Corey Asbury, and he's the same guy who wrote "Reckless Love." And I know that there's lots of people that go, "Oh, God's love's not reckless. We can't say that." And that's what you can have that opinion. I don't. I'm not going to battle you on it. I have a different opinion. I think it goes along with trying to, what I was saying earlier, was just trying to understand a God in human terms when God is not a human. And all we can do is use our human words and our human concepts and our human brains to try to understand him. But he is so far beyond and above that, that he is beyond that. And so that's free. That's not even about. So there's a song called "Kind," and it just starts off with just a real punch in your gut. It says this. It says. Sometimes babies die. Sometimes marriages fail. Those things that we pray for, sometimes they just don't happen. And then we try to begin like this forensic search. It's like, did I just not have enough faith? Was I just not good enough? Was God, what's going on? Like, how come you didn't answer my prayer? Often not often, but sometimes Jesus is asked that question. One of them being time when Mary and Martha found him and said, my Lazarus is dead. If you'd just been here a few days earlier, Lord, you could have saved him. It says Jesus wept to hear the brokenness and the hurt in their hearts and their voices. He wept. Shortest verse in the Bible. But he wept. And I think that when we're left trying to hold together a faithful understanding of who God is, what Jesus says, what Paul says in the New Testament about more than conquerors, and there's no weapon formed against us that can prosper, and we have the keys that open to all riches and all blessings and all of them waiting for us, and yet when we look at the world and we realize that sometimes little innocent babies die. They get sick, and no prayers save them. Sometimes two people decide they can't stay married anymore, and no amount of prayer or Bible study or singing worship songs or going to church or pretending makes it better or mends it. They just decide it's not going to happen. And what do we do with that? How do we find an answer in that kind of silence? Or in that kind of God saying, no, I'm not going to heal you. I'm not going to heal your child. I'm not going to heal your marriage. What do we say? One of the things that holidays really create that a lot of times people don't remember or don't understand or just kind of forget. I mean, I guess that's not remembering, but it's not on purpose. But holidays are some of the hardest times for people. For those that have lost loved ones, there's silence because they'll never hear from those people again. Some people who were married for 40 years and they lose their spouse, and now they try to go through life and go through holidays, and all of the memories are so great, but they also just remind you that person is gone, and it brings up the silence of that person's presence. The words that they would have said, the things they would have said, the space they would have taken up is deep, and it rages in hurt. And so the silence is brokenness, it's death. And so on holidays, there are people who grieve. And that's okay. Like, grief is okay. Like, if you read through the Psalms, grief is healthy. It is actually healthy to grieve. It's healthy to mourn. It's healthy to express our true feelings to God. Because God is bigger than that. Now, we have to accept that God may not leave us that way, but we don't have to be afraid to tell God how we really feel about things. God already knows. You can't hide things from God. So let's be honest. And one of those things is that holidays hurt for a lot of people. They for many people, they bring back the joys as they think about all the family gatherings, Thanksgiving, and all the food and gathering together. But they also bring back a side of all the people who are now dead, that have passed, and the holes that they leave in our lives, and the silence that they leave, because they won't be speaking any longer. They won't have any new things to say. We'll only have the memories. And that silence can be heavy, and it can just rest on the heart and weigh you down. It's interesting that, to me, it's interesting that Jesus goes to the garden to pray. And he prays. And he's in desperate situation. And he says, God, if you could take this cup from me, please do so, but not my will, but yours. There are times when Jesus gets baptized is the most famous one, where God responds. When Peter and John are with Jesus and on the Mount of Transfiguration, there's the thunder and God responds. But when Jesus was in his darkest night, his darkest place, his darkest terror, feeling all the feelings that a human would, the night before his death, the night before his suffering, he cries out to God. And we have no record of God answering. So if you find yourself in a difficult place, having a hard time with the silence, struggling with a lack of answers, missing that response that you were hoping to get from God, take heart. Because you're just like Jesus. And Jesus understands. I think that's one of the reasons why Jesus says to his disciples, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Even when it feels like I have. Even when you think I've gone silent, I'm still there. Even when you can't see it, even when you can't feel it, even when you can't understand. There's a great song by Rich Mullins. I'll post a link to it on YouTube or something in my podcast page so that you guys can find it too. But it's a song that he writes called "Hard to Get." And it's prayer to Jesus. It's on the oh man, I'm forgetting the title of the album. I'll put it in there. It's on these recordings that he made in this church. They're just demos because it was the last recordings he made before he was in a car accident in Illinois and passed so long ago. But he just began to he began to think about how different God is and how big God is and how far away God is. And then you just begin to ask, God, do you care? Do you care? Are you how does a God who lives in eternity care about me? How does a God who's infinite and has all they need, how do you care about me? Why would you care about me? And maybe you just maybe you're just up there playing hard to get. And I think that's a question sometimes that we struggle with answering, because at church we want to we want to say, oh, don't worry, or it'll be better, it's gonna get better, and I do think it will, but there's just going to be a struggle. What do you do when your prayers go unanswered? What do you do when what you were hoping for you don't get? And you have Paul, who writes so many great and glorious things. I have found the secret to contentment. I know how to find joy, whether I have little or a lot. We are more than conquerors. No weapon formed against me can prosper. I know that I serve the God of all things, who can make all things and will turn all things around. And yet he was also imprisoned and beaten and eventually killed for his faith. How do you find joy and hope? That's what I want to look at this next 5 podcast. Although next week we're going to talk about darkness, and so it's not going to give a whole lot of answers. But I hope that as we walk through Advent together, that if you have some of these questions, if you find yourself in a very similar place, that you'll join in and walk with us, walk with me as I walk through the Advent season, and see where God takes us, and see what God answers, and see how God speaks to us. I don't want to I don't want to leave on such a dark note, because I don't want to give the impression that there's no hope. But I do want to just go out on that somber note. A realization that sometimes our growth in following Jesus takes us through this place, this desert, this wilderness, where it just seems like we can't find God. So if you're there, keep going, keep pushing, keep asking questions, keep seeking. Find somebody that will pray with you and for you, and celebrate the small things, and encourage you, because God will use those times to do big things. If nothing else, he used those times to shape you to be more like the person he wants you to be. Silence is unsettling. It ushers in all of the worries and the anxieties and the hurts and the pains that we have tried to push away. But for this week, for this time, can we embrace it a little bit? Can we seek it? Just to sit in silence and seek who God is, what God is doing, who he is, and ask the hard questions and wait for the good answers. I hope you find some peace this week. Hope you find some joy this week. Like I say, if you're sorry, leaves that on a little bit of a more somber and note at the end, but this is the journey. I want to. The next two are just kind of the prior to Advent kind of vibe, feeling. So I want to rest and meditate in that a little bit. So that's what we're gonna do. So thank you for listening. May God bless you. Hope you have a wonderful week.